Hello everyone, today we introduce central northern Italian warfare from the 11th to the 14th century, roughly, for our regional warfare series. By the way, I will not tell which couple of regions are left to actually complete the entire Europe, right? There is, say, another path, of course, which we will see with some higher degree of approximation, but not too much. Say everything up to Southeast Asia, right, moving south and east. That is a very important series, as it sort of lays like the foundations of probably the essentials, that the ABC of, say, the warfare of every single region in Eurasia, North Africa. And Italy is one of those chapters in medieval warfare that I think, after decades of continuous military historical studying, is perhaps the single most and incomprehensibly underrated one in the entire medieval warfare specific. And this is not to say that we're talking an area that, I don't know, was secondary, and so as a consequence, people did not take into consideration. Italy, of course, is very central to all the major Western European affairs. It's also overwhelmingly documented. Italy has the most intense, more advanced historiography of the period, has the highest level of literacy, of wealth concentration, like even just archaeologically, in terms of material culture, of urbanization. Like, there is really a lot, right? But for different reasons that I don't think we will be addressing today, I shall make another video on its own, has been somehow popularized just in a sort of incomplete fashion. And again, this doesn't get simply down to, like, okay, Italy is, of course, suffering of that mostly because it's just Rome and the Renaissance. So most people ignore, I think, most essentials of medieval Italian history in general, because they tend to attribute to what they think was, say, a fragmented landscape, some sort of lack of consistency down the local level, which is perhaps the very key for fixing this prejudice and this misunderstanding, because political fragmentation is a mantra that is repeated all the time. And of course, when we look at central northern Italy at this point, we do see essentially at the peak of the great medieval civilization, 30 city-states that are effectively warring against one another. This is not, however, just a matter of saying, well, yes, individually they were very rich, and so they had also powerful militaries in that sense. But we tend to skip the level of cohesion and cooperation that these city-states normally had. So that if we are actually speaking of the largest armies in the Middle Ages, even just for the frequency and the absolute number of troops involved, the intensity of belligerence, Contamine, and many authors really pointed this out. The same Mallet, even though he concentrated more on the Condottieri and more of this aspect, because that's the point. Like, to most people, Italian warfare in the Middle Ages is fundamentally the Condottieri, right? And they pictured this as the single most important thing they ever did, right? No. Right, there is all the communal phase before, and we're not just talking about the more famed Legnano or Cortenuovo, like some of the that we'll cover partly. Also made a video about Legnano. I think I should remake one actually, because it was very, very long time ago, and now we'll definitely do it in a better format, given the importance of the battle. But that's paradoxically actually still a yet to be developed phase of the Italian art of war that literally booms at a shocking level between the second half of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th centuries, right? And this phase, it lasted some generations. Of course, is reflective of the great communal civilization in fact, the peak of medieval civilization as well, what was going on in Italy with especially the Guelph, Papal, Angevin axis, but also with the Germanic Ghibelline coming back at the time of Henry VII, etc., is actually the single most developed art of war that I can honestly record after years of thorough examination of old fact regional warfare, not just through the series, of course, in Europe, and realizing, as it's also notorious, that virtually no one, nor say the Italians did do so, but it's not that it's too solid. Like there is a solid military historical tradition regarding the Middle Ages. Treating a battle or another for local reasons is not just having like a sound. This is admittedly not existing anywhere, right? But this is actually the point, because Italian warfare in some other ways has been sort of popularized, and yet the single most important core of it that you cannot really ignore, because it's again not a peripheral or secondary phase. This is the age of Dante. This is the age of great battles, like literally the largest in Europe. The one of Montecatini in 1315, I think, is the largest of the period, as well as, unsurprisingly, also from a strictly historical point of view, the one that actually displays the single most advanced combined armed tactics ever recorded in I think in the entire medieval warfare. If we're talking, of course, about complex maneuvers in terms of like enveloping, etc., like we can speak of the Mongols in similar ways, but in Western Europe, I have never seen armies of that size having that specific tactical modules of essentially three battle lines in depth with, we're talking single wings of 5,000 drilled infantry that is able to remain close to cavalry and with flank reserve. This all come from, they are to be found everywhere, but with the same level of synergy with the breaking, sometimes even fourth line flank units attacking, and this pattern being repeated over and over, like just not one battle every 25 years, but with armies that like the one of Milan or Florence, that alone had things like 30,000 men on campaign, even multiple armies at a time. Well, that is something that honestly, like if you look even at the history of the major monarchies out there, is not recorded with the same homogeneity, with the same constancy, with the same level of actual expense. It's clear, for example, that at sea the Italians pour that hell of shockingly disproportionate amount of financial wealth that actually also took away a lot of further resources from this already highly advanced land forces. And most of these battles, the entire sort of political background has not been studied for the most obvious reasons that most PhDs, most researchers in general do not have the competence for studying the, in say, morally and scientifically objective detail, in historical method, the political and military and also social history of 30 different city-states from local, Italian vernacular, Latin, an enormity of sources, like we're talking 30, 40 chronicles, essentially, documenting all these events in an incredibly thick way that, again, paradoxically provides us with the single best level of documentation of warfare in the entire medieval millennium. Because, yes, later you have sort of starting at the thresholds of modern era having sort of more records, but we're talking, say, administratively speaking, for example. But those are just prescriptive sources more of the time. When you reconstruct, for example, a Condottieri battle, the narrative sources that are still making 90-95% of all you need to learn about the battle are incredibly vague compared to the early 14th century. A great deal of European modernity is born exactly at the time of Dante, of Villani, or of Compagni. Here we're talking mostly Tuscan sources, but actually the Lombards didn't kid either, and the Neapolitan kingdom, for example, we don't talk about this now because it belongs to another regional series. In fact, it's actually one of the two that we miss. Little spoiler. But it doesn't have the same level of documentation because it's more of a feudal system, but we actually see that they had the same type of art. And there would be a lot of other things we'll see now to point out, not just also for the previous centuries and how this system had come to be, but regarding also how this affected the rest of medieval warfare, because as I always pointed out, there is this sort of hyper bias towards sole infantry victors, and in the process of looking at definitely important situations, like for example Scotland or Flanders, we are still looking at systems that were objectively much more backwards than what the Italians had at the time, and that of course did not need, given the civilizational completion of the same, like such a division or such a circumstance, whichever it was, for which cavalry or infantry had to fight against one another, separated, right? And so having an asymmetry in what was actually the regular Western, otherwise the regular Western, in fact, art of war. Like cavalry is a decisive arm, and so this thing also, the rise of infantry, as we know, has been overrated. And actually, at the same time, the Italians had also the best infantry, which it is actually the paradox here, that an army can have the best infantry, but not needing this infantry to actually be opposed to cavalry, but because actually, like, they would be opposed to cavalry, but only after having crushed their counterparts on the wings, and then falling on the back of cavalry, but in that sense, just annihilating a unit just because it was outflanked mainly. And not receiving enough credit for this, because you've heard, of course, very often of things like the Genoese crossbowmen, and or the general, say, Italian civilization, sophistication in military affairs at this times, in military engineering, naval warfare. This is kind of obvious. But it's also intuitive, it should be intuitive at least, that the land forces had an equal level of development in the same way. And so again, there were areas that you can see it also in pop culture on YouTube. Like Italy maintains this name of the hyper-fragmented thing, even though there were areas in Europe that were even more politically fragmented, that are not described in that way, and actually areas of Europe that were much more politically compact than Italy, that had actually less military strength displayed. And so it's objective. I must give this much, that Italian history in the period is very difficult to understand because of the aforementioned reasons. Like, if you want to really understand how it worked, you must study every single place at a time. And this is something that historiography has not left much space for, because a bit of structuralism, and so the idea that you have to understand the whole, and especially the socio-economical side of the story. No, you must study every single damn city, every single damn imperial, royal rule, and the local feudal elements, and the papacy and the empire, and what these Italians were doing abroad, in order to even start claim that you have any familiarity with the fundamentals of this history. And as you understand, this is far beyond what most people even normally think of this time and place, which leaves us really with the most dramatic realization that yes, right, there is a very specific, there are also a bit cultural, national reasons such as that continental Europeans were sort of traumatized by fascism, so they sort of rejected it. There was Contestation in 1968. The Marxists came to overflow the field, and they sort of eliminated military history. And as a consequence, the Anglo-Saxons that were writing about war, because at least they won World War II, and they legitimately cared about their military tradition, began to make some interesting disclosing compendia, works, also in wargamism, etc., to say, okay, let's look at the wall. They wouldn't find too much stuff coming from the same Italian sources, secondary sources, of course, because again, the period is immense. Just like a European in general, a Westerner should be aware. Of course, it should be very much about periods like Dante's one, but even the ones of the times of the Lombard League and more. But let's say the consequence is that if you read in this text the part on, say, the Irish warfare, you get 10 pages, which is more or less the same that you get for Italian warfare in comparison, the same book. So it's objectively the damage has been done. There is a massive gap left completely senselessly and shamefully open, simply by people's ignorance and incompetence. I would like to point out that the Oxford Encyclopedia of Medieval Warfare mentions battles like Campaldino, for example, or Ottopascio, mostly because they inherited the Tuscan perspective in the storytelling. It's a bit like the modernistic source of even of storytelling coming from Florence, but inexplicably leaving out the same Montecatini is not mentioned, and this is not again a small secondary battle. It's just the biggest deal you can imagine. It's absent, right? I don't know whether they mention the Battle of Zappolino because of the stolen cattle, for which on YouTube now we have look at these weirdos, they killed each other because of the cattle. That's just a legend of a thing that came later. I was made famous by a famous work in the modern age, and actually the Battle of Zappolino is one of the most important battles of the period. It's actually very big, also in terms of tactical and operational deal, but of course nobody knows about that side of the story. And also in general, other battles, and especially the interest in the actual Italian military institutions does not seem to have reached very far, right? There is perhaps also a bit this bias that since Italy was more about infantry, right? So it must have been less about the knight. That's also another common mistake, at least it's an impression I've gotten from the general way, which is not, I'm going to say it may be exaggerated, right? But the sense that this infantry warfare was more developed, that is not to be understood in that oppositional sense to cavalry, but if anything, in a developmental sense in parallel, right? And we'll have to make other videos. There is an entire playlist I made about medieval infantry warfare, in which I explained why different peoples sort of at some point came to fight, for example, with infantry made only by infantry alone, which was not a flattering thing in the first place. And in fact, also the same victories are to be contextualized politically and strategically, and they do not actually bring to the same results, even when they are actually very important from a tactical point of view. Just yesterday we were talking about the Dithmarsch, for example, and it's obvious that they were not, say, as relevant as the Flemish, say, just to make an example. But they are important. We talk about them because we cover the entirety of Europe. And so with today's video, as you understand, it's just the first part, because there is, again, a shockingly large amount of evidence coming from Italy. Again, the largest. There is nothing to do about this. Not even France. France and Italy were objectively the most militarily advanced countries. But France had a type of society that contained, was controlled just by a very narrow elite, right? Even just properly in a numerical sense. And as a consequence, even though we have magnificent French art, this is, looking, say, representing things from a particular cut, right? In Italy, there is a much greater range of information also about the infantry element, for example. But in general, again, a level of development in absolute terms that is really, really impressive. So first of all, let's talk, as we always do for this series at the beginning, about the actual political geography to understand what we're talking about. Because, of course, when we talk about central northern Italian civilization in general, we are talking, respectively, the Tuscan Lombard civilization, right? Other areas of Italy were, of course, particularly advanced for medieval European standards, but they do not have the same level of documentation and history proper of these other areas. There was admittedly, and I should point this out also to debunk further that sense of the disunity, is that and we've seen it very often in the series about the Italian communes, that the actual political institutional development of Italian communes was very homogeneous as synchronic, right? These were, again, you think 30 city-states, they all had a different thing going on. Absolutely not. Basically, the communal history started also institutionally with the synchrony of the major changes in regime forms, right? The communes are born with the consuls in that specific generation. Year more, year less, but that's the same time. They all do the same thing. Then the podesta arrives the same years, right? And then the signori arrive, and this happens pretty much homogeneously all across central and northern Italy, so that even if there are variances in level of development and intensity of warfare, for example, etc., at least in absolute terms, the actual level of homogeneity of these political, military, and social systems is very high, right? Other there were kingdoms in Europe that had incredibly heterogeneous differences within themselves, right? Probably in levels of political, civil, and administrative development. This is not the case of Italy. That basically is not ruled by anyone. The Germanic emperors do come exercising their prerogative, and not just in a violently impositive way, but of course in a fashion would turn out to eventually delegate most of the power to the locals through cooptation, etc. So also the wars that broke out for the control over Italy were essentially fought by, foreigners were present in these regions, quite often by this historical, role, but fundamentally that the Italians were fighting alongside them or against them, depending on the situation. This is how eventually, especially from the mid 13th century, that the system is de facto in the hands of the locals to a truly statal extent, right? And later on, in fact, there is probably a regionalization of power. We have the city-states in the mid 14th century that basically take each other out like banana. They remain the cornerstones individually of however larger domains of the bigger city over the others. So that's mostly what you see in the later Middle Ages, also on a political map, right? So of course we're looking here chiefly, by approximation, we could say the Kingdom of Italy, but we're actually here talking also about the Papal States, Venice, and we will see now why it's a bit more shaded, at least in an institutional sense, because the Kingdom of Italy is part of the Holy Roman Empire proper, right? So it included all the present Italian state north of Abruzzo, plus that instead pertained to the Kingdom of Sicily, plus part of the Campania south of Rome, right? The big problem, I made multiple videos about this, is that when we look at the Papal States, this was, yes, geographically contained within the Kingdom of Italy, but it was institutionally not part of it, not part of the Holy Roman Empire, not part of any possible earthly dominion. So aside from this ideal romantic vision, yes, the cities of the Papal States were also ruled by the emperors at times. They had their own civil, secular authority. And there was, this has also remained, like in the modern country, like essentially it's from this point that the South sort of goes its own way, and with a feudal kingdom, while central and northern Italy maintain, in fact, a higher level of civilization, of production, and a homogeneity, also like a contact with one another. We made so many videos about other important topics from the communes, the maritime traffics, so I don't think there is much need to repeat here what was going on, but as you know, these were quite powerful, independent-minded, and entrepreneurial communities that essentially confer themselves a truly statal profile starting from the 13th century, right? When you talk about city-states, at least in the sense of the Italian communes, just know that they weren't quite just every independent city is a state just per se. At least you can make the case. It depends. Like we talk about city-states for, in fact, cities that had definitely not the same level of statehood, but at least within, right, the institutional development of the Italian communes, the sort of the unified authority of the commune, sort of exercising truly all public functions, at least and supervising over the various communities living within the city district, is around the mid 13th century, right? So looking at the northern borders of these areas, they were roughly the ones of the modern country, except for Südtirol. I made a video about medieval Tyrol and Trieste as well. In Venice, as you know, that was essentially born within the Byzantine Empire, so strictly speaking, laying outside the Holy Roman one, is still included by our survey since it's a fully Italian reality. So in terms of political, military, and social development, it followed basically the same pattern. This was, of course, the gateway to the east, major maritime republic. There was a lot of Byzantine influence, as you know, but the essence is unequivocal as well. Like Venice had developed within properly like an Italian context. Like just also, you can argue most Byzantine communities since, say, the end of the Gothic War had sort of eventually autonomized their own identity, sort of in this decentralized context, growing very similar to like also the non-Byzantine held part of the peninsula. So by the mid-14th century, you have the full affirmation of the Papal States in a political territorial sense. This time was still far from the full statalization of the system. Essentially, the Pope starts claiming back all those territories that had already been bequeathed to him, but that had never been under direct control. Like the Pope had, by this point, like controlled mostly the area around Rome. So you have Rome, Latium, Umbria. I made a video about medieval Lazio, by the way, if you're interested. Spoleto, made a video about that as well. The Marches, and much of today's Emilia-Romagna, that as a consequence had actually drifted out of the direct, or at least desired, control of the Holy Roman Emperors. And so again, for the rest, there are differences in the level of urbanization, across this territory, but the cultural, linguistical, political ones are practically the same. So three main themes you can argue dominate the history of central and northern Italy during this period. From one side, we've seen it in some video, and there is a decline of the imperial feudal authority. This is true from top to bottom of the hierarchy, like the Holy Roman Emperor and the smaller feudal lords. Right, the cities are the actual protagonists of Italian history from quite a while. Right, this had been true uninterruptedly since Roman times. There's never a time in Italian history in which the city had not controlled the entire space, right? As properly as a center of power for whichever ruler had established itself there. This is particularly true exactly for Lombardy and Tuscany, because these had been the direct basis of control of the Italic kings since Lombard times. The Italic kingdom had evolved actually in a quite tidy way, exactly as it had been founded on city elites and administration. We're talking about literate rulers. There was a great, as you know, juridical tradition in Italy. These were the areas in which Roman law was being revived through actually a hack of a previous legal tradition. Conversely, southern Italy had declined in urbanism, and especially in the liberty of the individual cities under the Byzantines, and powers that had sort of deteriorated in a more privatistic sense, right? So the idea of civic identity, the fact that the Italian communes, and this is incredibly important, were founded as communities of not only citizens in arms, but as it was believed in the very original Romano-Germanic sense of the term, of noblemen in arms, right? These people were used to be free. This is not, say, freedom is often used as an evocative term that, when you look back at the reality, especially of the Middle Ages, is quite romantic and idealistic. What people tend to confuse when the states were sort of weak, if non-existent, is that people in that sense are not free. Like the average person is not really a free person. It's more than else somebody else's person, depending on somebody else. And there is a great level of erosion of individual liberty in apparently very sort of autonomous systems. This is not the case here, right? These people, like properly their military organization and their sense of pride, also of challenge towards imperial authority, that they are loyal subjects to, but in exchange, of course, of the recognition of their own rights, right, as citizens and subjects, in fact, is truly the hallmark of this region, right? As a forma mentis, that there is no equivalent in the globe at this point in history, and that's also, in fact, where most of, say, the humanistic or Renaissance political thinking sort of emerges from the more republican regimes. Naturally, this doesn't mean that, in fact, feudal power was absent, but this had especially after Charlemagne's conquest, been properly grafted in the country. It was essentially a novelty in that, at least Frankish vassalatic beneficiary sense, but it had been invariably revolving around the city when it had not been hinged on it. Mostly it's the bishops that also, because of Ottonian backing, maintained a true public power in the city. The same Italian communes are essentially a sort of very cleverly ingenious usurpation, right, by pseudo-legal means by these citizens to actually act on behalf of the same bishop. The rural nobility, so the more feudal one, had, in fact, just not been ousted by the city because they had always sort of been living in the city and not. And actually, the communes are founded by the milites, the consuls, like the properly the officials that rule the commune in the first phase, are the actual knights, and these had been all part of the traditional imperial feudal hierarchy. We've seen it, and it may sound a bit confusing if you're not familiar with the period, but the thing I'm interested in providing you the most is the idea is that these systems compenetrated each other. They did not oppose one another in an essential way, right? And so also the military product was always the same, right? Cavalry developing in old post-Carolingian lands, infantry being this more pumped, let's say, extra than the usual because of these fierce and municipal communities to which also of course the knights belonged proudly, and this would be effectively the sap bringing also to the wars of the Lombard League, the League of Verona, that even preceded the former, that, as you know, were waged chiefly against Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II's attempts to subdue, in fact, this enormously rich and divided area, so that the better target in theory, that, however, ended up for becoming like a graveyard for the same empire. This was actually, at least for the same Germanic imperial ambitions, because that's it was an enormous effort made to try to subdue this era that objectively would have allowed the restoration of a sort of centralized Roman Empire, like with Holy Roman Emperors ruling from places like Rome or Palermo and de facto reuniting Eastern and Western Church, like dominating, of course, from there the entire Mediterranean, making even the same Germany actually a sort of peripheral province, but still reinforcing like an unprecedented level of Catholic power. This, however, was like say a project that the same Italians were pursuing. There were lots of Ghibellines fighting for that dream, but was carried out in such a way by the emperors that rendered evident how this would have come at the expense of the local liberties and autonomies. And that's why you have this gruesome wars that absorb a great deal of resources from both sides, and that, when are over, also in fact leave space for some of the most also militarily expensive phases in the Italian art of war. Right, it's all fuel for it, but let's say what the Italians also begin to accomplish by subduing one another had been the original problem, actually, why the same Frederick Barbarossa had come to Italy, like Lodi asking help from Milan, right? But at the end of the day, like Lodi siding actually with Milan in the end when they saw what the imperial purpose was about. And on the longer run, in fact, cities like Milan, like Verona, like Florence, etc., like coming to actually take over other cities successfully, which is yet actually yet another Italian exception of this all. Like in Europe, nor elsewhere, actually, there is such a thing like a city that has, in medieval times, that power to actually subdue another city in a truly political territorial sense, right? Like creating a state and incorporating other cities. Like other cities in Europe have barely the capacity to have some power around their walls, right? Because there is normally like a bishop or a count that has mostly a landed property in the countryside and that is superior, right, to these communes. Italy is the other way around. Italy is, if you want, is also sort of an upside down world for what was the feudal traditional norm. That's why there is something really also in the political and strategical planning. If you look at the wars of the Lombard League from a German side, that that expresses the astonishment that things like, free, say, citizens, right, commoners that dictate rule to, with these massive cities, like Milan had 100,000 inhabitants, it was the largest in Europe. It was something properly even as an environment, something unseen, right? In Italy, there is not such thing like, the world of the forest in an extensive sense, where there are communities that are literally secluded from the rest, everything is taken over by the city, right? And these people, again, are like more literate. They actually regulate themselves in unprecedentedly advanced way. And this is reflected evidently by their same military capacities that are, as we will see now, quite astonishing. On the other side, we see the territorial power of the papacy, we were pointing out before, leading to the intertwine, of course, with the political strife between the same communes and the emperor, because largely the Lombard League was founded by the papacy, as you know. As we've seen in many videos, this struggle passed through different phases that were all marked by actually large-scale warfare that we tend sort of also to forget about, especially when we look, for example, at the investiture controversy that also never really ended. Right, one normally talks 1075, 1122, right, Gregory VII, the Concordat of Worms, but all these clashes, like with emperors being excommunicated, etc., something goes on sort of forever, as long as especially the Germans try to reassert direct control on Rome, or at least are heading towards that direction. Then eventually the relations with the papacy normalize in the very later Middle Ages, because the Germans eventually, like in the Renaissance, are actually allies. At least, of course, the Catholic Habsburgs maintain this partnership with the Spanish, etc. It's not like the issue anymore. The Italian wars had at least settled that, but with the decline of universal authorities by the mid 14th century, like these powers simply shrink regionally, and so they don't kind of threaten each other anymore. Like at this point, there is probably the peak of an imperial universal policy that was truly European and Mediterranean scale, right? So there are, of course, multiple German invasions in the 12th and the 13th century. As you will see, these actually also leave a mark in Italy. Like the Germans are quite habitual frequenters of the Italian peninsula today, just like on vacations in summer, just like at the time during the good season with their ministeriales, and during the Raumfahrt. And this is also quite interesting. It's sort of underrated because this German-Italian compenetration is usually, these are taken as if they were the extreme in European identity, but you think about it, they were, especially during the Middle Ages, very closely intertwined. They interfere. They were different, absolutely. Also, this did not really help during these clashes, like even to settle matters, negotiating. But this was a fully traditional world in which you shouldn't be reasoning by nationalities when you consider like the ultimate Catholic purpose, and that's how, in fact, they really wouldn't. Right, and that's why the Welf Ghibelline struggle is something deeper. So much so that it actually develops further in Italy proper. And that's why we call them Welfs and Ghibellines, which is the Italianate version of, as you know, of the Welfen and Ghibelline, the latter being the Hohenstaufen war cry after their castle. Because at that point, and this is very evident, just in the political and the military sense of it, whichever let's say the ruler wanted to affirm itself in Italy or getting something from it, needed invariably the support of the local subjects that were, especially given their their deep like international involvement financially, say politically, culturally, were deciding, so we're already set right against each other to be supported by this or that power. And so it's not simply, it is also like, this is very important, and I have a video incoming on the Battle of Montaperti for that matter to illustrate it, the so-called campanilistic, right? Campanile in Italian meaning bell tower, and so it's another way of saying municipal pride. So with rivalries between neighbors were so, there are sort of the, if you want, even the more locally miserable thing of, say, the pre-modern world in many ways, and of course it applies pretty much to all of Europe at this point, but that, and this is also extremely important to understand when studying Italian warfare, always part of this, they're just like the lower, say, territorial level of the higher struggle, right? These were never just like raiding the opposite countryside just for the harvest, the loot, and so on. It was always like, there is the Pope behind us, there's the Emperor behind us, there are powers involved, France, Aragon, whatever. It's always done to specifically orient the commune towards a direction rather than another. And that's why this history is so difficult, because, again, the sources are all public, are all digitalized. It's in theory extremely easy to read all of this, and some events are at least pretty notorious that they don't need to be sort of discovered, but getting into them satisfactorily in a sort of analytical and sort of positive sense to make, especially to reconstruct satisfactorily the political and military history is a big challenge, because you have to digest an enormous amount of information. Other highlights are, well, the so-called Babylonian exile of the papacy in the city of Avignon, at the boundary between the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France on the Rhone, which wasn't really like a captivity whatsoever. Actually, the papacy was all fine with this. While there was, of course, like a French period in the papacy, this went in parallel with this popes would do the papal benefit, of course, like even though they were allied with the French crown in the first place, and this is true by reflection also within the papal states, right? There was a lot of criticism for the Curia to have left Rome. And so there is also a lot of dramatization about this, and the fact that Rome had been left alone. This was the terrible moment in which Rome sacked and whatever. Well, it was just like still an important place. Things were not so disastrous as were depicted. The Avignonese papacy ended in 1377, after which Rome became once again the physical, at least, see, because they had never ceased to be, of course, like the seat of the papacy institutionally. But this also falls outside our period. We'll surely talk about the Condottieri at some point, not today, because even though the condotta does appear pretty early in time, already by the 13th century we have the actual term, it's just like a contract, right? And so it's a military contract, not a big deal. It existed before, but let's say, of course, this came to, of course, define an entire era in Italian warfare that today we sort of stop like towards the mid 14th century. That, again, it's been a bit too... many of you have asked me actually to talk about the Condottieri, which I will have to do. I'm actually working to find enough solid material to probably start a sub-branch of the cycle, probably about 14th, 15th century single Italian sort of, especially seigneurial powers, which is also difficult to find a bit in a homogeneously comparable and presentable fashion, for the same reasons I was talking about before, a bit like this, about the same city-states. I will have to talk about probably the the Condottieris battles and military and like the soldiers of fortune, in fact the foreign companies, etc. But I would like properly in this specific video, at least this video will take probably a couple of episodes to finish, to picture properly the age of communal warfare, which is, in especially the latter part, the one in which you see the Condottieri appearing, but that in which like the public army is still like a hell of a leviathan, right? And it's a hell of an incredibly advanced system. It's the coolest ever, right? Condottieri's warfare is not as cool as this one, but again, for some reason, they say the misinterpretation, especially not studying tactics, I think, has brought to this. Like, because again, one can study battle or another, but if you don't get that diachronic and comparative habit, you can't properly understand the fullest extent of this military machine. Or the Italian communal army should be one of the single most famous armies in pop culture, right? For the ones we have, I don't know, thought of, I don't know, the Roman legion, the Mongol armies, the Spar. This one is, in my opinion, as far as I've seen, tactically the peak of medieval warfare. I've never seen anything like this again, also in the rest of Western Europe. Again, by scale, we're talking about, of course, the same thing. It's not like the Italian armies are not born out of a different system from the one of Western Europe, right? They're the same, but they're implemented at a level that does not know the speak and continuity and homogeneity, by the way, in the rest of Western Europe. And I will exemplify this in other videos, because the numbers speak clearly. And again, the famous scholars sort of couldn't avoid to see this, but they could avoid to still make largely, say, effective study on the actual topic, because it would be such an immense thing to do in the first place. And people, disclosures, etc. haven't gotten the memo. So I may be the only channel actually talking about this, even pointing it out. Politically, there weren't just the communes, as we've seen. At the beginning of the period, you still have like the cities were there, etc., but they had not completely expressed this political autonomization. And the structures within which they operated were the feudal ones of the Kingdom of Italy. Already by this point, the various districts that made up the Italian territory, in this sense, there were a relatively few duchies and marches. Like this is like in any other normal regional situation. Then there were further subdivisions, counties historically. The reality of the country was already bypassing this, right? When we talk about fragmentation in this regard, we should be careful because how fragmented is what does it mean? A fragmented a political fragmentation, like properly a fragmented power, especially, right? Because you can have, this is true also for feudal context, like the feudal system is, if you want, even more fragmented, because yes, it's unitary in the hierarchy, but down the line it's very decentralized. This is kind of the same, but at the same time we see pretty much everywhere that also thanks to coalition armies, like single polities can field substantially large armies, right? And medieval armies weren't at all that small. It's usually stressed, right? There were times, of course, in which like there was, because of fragmentation, less need to just make a major effort towards one direction rather than another, because there weren't gluing factors pushing for, like, or pressuring properly for putting greater forces together. But here we're also witnessing an incredibly advanced level of, for example, in Castellation. Italy, among the various military primates, has the one of, in fact, fortification. We've seen it, I don't remember which video made about seigneurial Europe, that if you look at the time it takes for encastellation to become like a capillary phenomenon, right? From the south to northern Europe, there are essentially a couple of centuries, or even more, right? Italy is the place where this begins the earliest and in a more capillary way, right? The country is pretty rich. It has this also massive Roman legacy in terms of urbanism and infrastructure, and so, for example, like here, stone castles appear earlier. Like at least Italy wouldn't develop, for example, the same level of large castles like in the 12th century compared to more united countries like England or France. But the general level, right, of fortification, also considering the cities themselves that are huge, right, in terms of that level of fortification infrastructure, and there are many, by the way, and they are that militarily active, is really putting this country at a completely different level. Practically every level of local authority produced castle, right? Italy was a place in which there were people who specialized into building castles and not creating seigneuries on their own, but literally selling them, because there was so much material availability that this was also a thing. Naturally, in theory, this for the right to fortification was a public right, and so this tells you also the degree by which Italy at large had remained autonomous, to say the least, within the same Holy Roman Empire. This is a very important aspect of the wall. The German emperor has, first of all, to become emperor, has to go to Rome, so there is this routine event in which, in order to become Holy Roman Emperor, first of all, the German king has to obtain the Italic Iron Crown, right? So he has to go in places like Milan, Monza, Pavia. These are the old centers of the Lombard kingdom, and getting the crown there, and then going to Rome. And this means crossing the Alps, all the major Po Valley rivers, the Apennines, other rivers, valleys, along the Roman roads that were dotted all with major cities, right, fortified centers. So this was a very, it normally happened also in a smooth, right, and civilized way, but what was at stake there for Europe in terms of universal power, of course, depended in part by these single powers along the way. They wanted a bit of the merit for this, and so some sort of recognition by imperial authority, etc. Right, a reason for which the feudal military obligations to these distant German emperors that eventually had to come back to Germany. Like in this period, you don't have like emperors staying specifically in central northern Italy, right? You have the Hohenstaufen in Sicily for a while, but the Germans may campaign in Italy, may try, in fact, to leave. They do leave local vicars and so on, but they must come back to Germany because that's the basis of their power, and Germany is that sort of troublesome and violent as well. So that's also why the meeting of the German and the Italian military cultures is very beautiful in this period. But as we were saying, for this reason, the feudal military obligations to the emperor were actually light, right? At least they were up until the Hohenstaufen set their mind on literally conquering Italy establishing a direct control on the cities, and so virtually, and this is literally what they asked, drying up all the public prerogatives, and so the incomes that the Italian communes basically had subsumed for themselves, and that they were absolutely not willing to grant. Otherwise, they would. Like there was, for example, the Faldrum, this most obvious, like the contribution for the Imperial expeditions. This was something that the Italian subjects were willing, of course, to provide, etc. But at this point, the Imperials already wanted to take control, essentially, of all the income that the cities, like the public rights associated with the rule, was concerned, like reestablishing or strengthening like a feudal hierarchy, essentially extinguishing the local communal autonomies. And that's definitely what triggered the rise of the Lombard League, supported by the papacy, that did not want to be brought under as well. And in all this, most of Italian cities had, of course, themselves slipped out of feudal aristocratic control, right? They were essentially either directly responsible to the emperor or lying under local ecclesiastical authority. This is probably we look at the beginning of the period. Now, I've made some videos explaining how the cities worked, and sort of like Italy worked in general, before the rise of the communes, right? And there were some paramilitary institutions, at least because the militas proper were still connected properly to the imperial hierarchy, so the communal militas would sort of officially emerge later, but again, they were living already in the same context, practically. So this phase is not particularly popularized, but the local warfare at the beginning of the period was already very advanced, right? It's not just a matter of technology. Obviously, it was very, very advanced as well, but we can observe as early as the 9th century early forms of couché lance techniques in Italian cavalry training, which, if you have an idea of how long it took, naturally also in Italy herself to develop the full form, but in fact how still uncertain this stuff was by this time. Well, you're really amazed. Here I honestly can't explain because the 9th century, of course, is very early, and when you look at, so this is a Carolingian period, and the Lombards were not a feudal power. Like they did not have the heavily militarized, heavily armored, and virtually professional elites that the Carolingians had, at least not in the same quantity. So this training is not just random as a form of art, like evidence and stuff like that. So Italy was not the place where the finest Carolingian cavalry was drawn from, right? But it was still like particularly advanced to the point that perhaps for also the better local documentation we get right this evidence, and it is really impressive because it shows, of course, that Italian cavalry was already pretty much in tune with the new wave, so we can say. And of course, like every Romano-Germanic people had undergone its own process of, say, gradual feudalization, even before the Franks. So the decline of feudal obligation and of a rural-based military aristocracy went on throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. But actually, there were actually very powerful feudal families in Italy. I recently made a video about, for example, Conrad of Montferrat, just to make an example about like a Crusader hero, let's say. And so it's, as I stressed before already, like you don't have to think like, okay, Italy, lands of cities means there was no such thing like that feudal ethos or whatever. Absolutely not. the Italians have the same knights, like in all of Europe. Their only distinguishing characteristic is that they live in the city, right? Everybody had their own. The Germans had the unfree knight. There is naturally a level of military organization that is different, that is sort of unique, but it cannot, of course, exclude nor heavy cavalry, nor the same feudal system within Italy. Of course, the local lords are not obliterated, are not erased, are not eradicated. They are actually there. It's just that they start obeying the communes, and they get pretty much subsumed by them in the process. Then there are certain areas that are particularly more feudal, as we will see. I don't know, Piedmont or northeastern Italy or the Apennine hinterland. It's obviously more like that. Like there is less of a urban culture. There is like more, in fact, feudal bondage, more castles, etc. At the same time, those are also, in fact, peripheral areas as far as military development happens. Now, what really the commune had taken over to establish a veritable provincial power was the Contado, in Italian the comitatum, which means the county, essentially, which in turn had historically been just the ancient Roman district of the various civitates, right? And again, I can't stress enough how these communities had continued uninterruptedly existing from Roman times. These ones, in other parts of Europe, especially in the north, you have a discontinuity in the population of cities. Some are abandoned, are repopulated later. There are different things. Of course, this happens in Italy too, because there were so many other different towns, etc. But the main, like these 30 city-states in central northern Italy, are essentially the sort of most important Roman cities that had existed back in the day. Just recently I made a video about ancient Florence, for example, just to start telling the history of medieval Florence, which I think is quite appropriate. Well, this is pretty much almost for all of these centers, right? And so, as Roman cities, these were also the seat of the diocese, in a land of such old Christianization, and the same see eventually of the Lombard dukes, the Frankish counts, and so the most elementary tacit, like down at local level, of public power. Well, public power was exercised down the line. This was true, like, again, the Carolingian Empire. Every place was framed within a county. Yesterday we were talking about the one of Dithmarschen. And then, of course, what was in the county varied a bit depending on the at least in scale, like, from the place. But it had technically been the city, right? At least the town. And the Contado control was very important. I made a couple of videos regarding this because this is, of course, the agricultural hinterland, right? It's the source of food, of revenue, and military manpower. And this presents quite strong political and strategical problems to the communes because, as you understand, your neighbor, which you're going to have, going to have multiple politically and military active neighbors, can enter your contado pretty quickly, right? There's just like a day of march, like with an army, from place to another. And this entailed, of course, an incredibly dynamic, policy in order to maintain control, and hence the very precocious inter-regional alliances that these Italian cities really do. The Lombard League being like proud of, in fact, the union of the Lombard cities. The Tuscans had their own. The northeastern Italy had its own, etc. Throughout, let's say, most of this period, let's say until the mid-13th century, Italian communal warfare is typically seasonal. Right? This is not really different from the one of other countries. In southern Europe, war begins earlier, in March, right? Think about the Field of May, like the Frankish armies, because in northern Europe it was colder, of course, for finding forage. Things were a bit more complicated. And this actually heightens the literal temperature, in fact, in turn, because of the more prolonged season of war in the Italian peninsula. The main objective is to devastate the enemy crops, to seize a castle or another. An average Italian city district is a few hundred square meters, which contains literally hundreds of castles that, of course, like as we were saying before, are smaller fortifications that nevertheless are quite effective in allowing the for a better defense, but that still are quite they can be stormed, destroyed, and cost, in fact, also to upkeep, to rebuild, etc. And think about the typical Italian agricultural, cheese, ham, all this stuff. These countries, these countries are as rich at the time. In fact, most of those food specialties are to be found, but in the same chronicles at the time, and even properly in the list of looted goods that every city took from one another. This is so important because, of course, such products were quite expensive at the time, especially at the times pre-industrial growth rate. You understand how resourceful these these are literally the richest communities in the globe per capita, but still, it's pre-industrial times. These rates are hurt, right? And there is an interesting process in this, because the loot was reinvested by the milites in the even in specialized crops in their own Contado, which gave job to the peasants that followed the knights. So it was all about this cycle, fundamentally. Cavalry and infantry, milites and pedites, were drawn from both the city and the district. This is incredibly important to stress. There was a difference. Normally, of course, the peasants were less performing than the citizens, but don't think of this this is in general true for medieval warfare. When we think about peasants going at war, we don't have to necessarily think, especially say in major armies, like the peasants being the literal guys with pitchfork that came out of the hut as soon as they knocked to go to war. That's not really how it worked, especially by the late 13th, early 14th century. If you look at these forces, they are sometimes as well equipped as the citizen forces, simply because the Italian communes statal resources allowed for them to be equipped actually with, by the way, it's sort of homogeneous in other places. For example, in the Flemish communes, they were technically not city-states, but the level of armament, like the Serberlier, the coat of mail, was pretty much there. Of course, just not for everyone, but still there was functional equipment, and the Italians had actually a pretty impressive array of pole arms, and actually mastered the ultimate development of billhook, right? I described this in the video about pole arms that had 4 functions, right? It was pulling, cutting, thrusting, and literally slicing, right? So it's this took also some kind of training, some kind of equipment. We have pretty extensive documentation about at least this prescriptional, let's say, issues, like what these communities had to provide for the equipment, what was provided for by the state as well. The most statalized realities were, of course, Lombardy, Tuscany. These are the Po and the Arno valleys, civilizations. They have like a very strong, like they're the most urbanized places in the world. The urbanization varies, right? Lombardy has sort of a more open and sort of flatter, as you know, so this outlook that allows so like the districts to be aligned in a sort of more orderly way. Tuscany is more hilly. The districts are more, let's say, irregular in shape, and the two systems develop, in fact, different, social balances. Like Lombardy, for example, never has the so-called people, the popolo, ruling the commune. Tuscany does, but it's also not universal there. And again, I explained what the popolo is in the videos about the Italian communes. This is, again, today we will skip that sort of scanning, right, of communal institutional development, because I don't want to make this more confusing. I want to stick to the military side of the story. But this goes in parallel also with properly the quality of the units, meaning that, for example, like before the statalization of the commune, you can argue that there is a more, for example, a greater participation of citizens, properly of the city dwellers, to the army, and that their quality is higher than the peasants, right? This is kind of obvious, right? Later on, what you have is a lot of substitutions. The more affluent citizens tend to, well, some actually see war, and they are very actually militarized for, right, a urban elite standard, because the Milas model has always remained the dominating one, and the Italian signori will always be men at arms. There's never like a soft sort of simply patriciate that doesn't do anything. Yet, of course, during the mid-14th century crisis, a great part of the people gets demilitarized. This is true all across Europe. But that's also kind of another story. I say this because I explained this in other videos, like the idea of the mercantile republics sort of prevails, as if, these guys were just merchants and were just, they weren't like other elites in Europe. Actually, they were as militarized. The point, though, is that system of substitutions occurs because these places have become overwhelmingly rich, and so they can't afford to pay for other people going to fight in their stead. Sometimes they were Italians. There is the cavallata system, for example, in Florence is being started because there is an abundance of material about this. But that's also how mercenarism actually starts increasing in the second half of the 13th century. And you start having also a lot of foreigners participating, French, Germans especially, and especially after the early 14th century expedition of Henry VII. German mercenaries had always been there. Manfred of Sicily had been sending them to Tuscany, as you know. There are, like, all the German expeditions into Italy had left Germans that had also, like, in that best of vagaries, sort of married into the local nobility, remained in office in some places, even though, right, the city dominated. Surely from the 13th century, the mid-13th century onwards, there is this increasing level, there is increasing scale of warfare, first of all, that comes with statalization. And so you have armies even easily of 3,000 knights and 30,000 infantry, or, even with different proportions. Villani says explicitly that the Milanese at the beginning of the 14th century had 5,000-6,000 barbuta. We're talking about single men at arms in Visconti's service. So we're talking about huge armies. These are actually the largest armies in Europe, together with the French one, right? We're talking the Visconti della Scala. I made a video about those. It's an impressive amount of force, mostly foreign, that can be paid, right? This goes in parallel, again, well, with this German-Italian duo because of the crisis of the ministeriales with the rise of the princes in Germany. And so all this German youth and probably knightly, right, forces come to Italy to get very good pay, and literally like allowing the local Italian lords to dispose of. And there are multiple instances of this, for example, with Ludwig of Bavaria, disposing of more German soldiers regularly than the same German rulers did, right? Which is very, very telling. In any case, the largest communal army of the late 13th, early 14th century is a semi-professional system of some sort. Like the knights are all professional because they're mostly these foreign mercenaries, plus the Italian patricians that pursue a knightly or feudal lifestyle too. Some come from, as we've seen, the Apennines as well. Plus you have all these communal forces, say communal levies that include some picked bodies of, for example, even up to 1,000 of professional crossbowmen. Right, these were typical, especially places like Pisa, Genoa, or at least these are the more famous ones. But I think that the actual quality of crossbowmen was pretty much the same all across Italy, and also just like the way that the art of war was really homogeneous, identical across the entire country, and tens of thousands of armed peasants, as we've seen, that, however, performed pretty well in terms of, for example, maintaining the alignment with cavalry during these complex maneuvers, fighting alongside them, closing themselves on the enemy wings. And so, again, there is no battle in which things go out of place. Like, the system is repeated, is uniform, is homogeneous, goes on for generations, and it's really an impressive one. We will talk about it now, speaking specifically about tactics, but it's really the single most underrated medieval army that I can think of, and not because it deserves just to be mentioned, but because it was likely the top one available in Europe. And such, of course, developments were connected also with the intense rivalry between the city-states, as we've seen, involved also in this broader international dance that was essentially fought over Italy itself, right? All the various concurrents here, the Germans, the Angevins, the Aragonese, were all trying, one another to get their place into Italy, and negotiating simply with the Italians how this would happen, except they were, in this sense, all clashing against one another, also in different theaters. There is, as we've seen, this feudal backbone of Italy that, if you want, follows the Apennines, but it's mostly concentrated also in central Italy. Central Italy was very much of a feudal place in many ways. Communes were present there, but the rural nobility was sort of stronger, and this is especially in the age of the Condottieri is evident that the best Condottieri came from the Papal States. The Colonna, the Orsini, the Montefeltro, these were all the expression of that military aristocracy that had remained, like in this sort of more backwards Papal States, that, however, had it been properly united in a statal sense, would have objectively been the strongest of all the Italian signories, which is a very underrated aspect. Mercenaries are also common in these areas because the lords of the deep Apennine sell their services to the richer city-states, the Montefeltro in Pisa, for example, reforming the local army and actually providing the peasants with the best army of the early 14th century in Italy. You have, again, all these variously famous names. And you have even small communes, or at least smaller communes than the Lombard and the Tuscan average, that make early use of mercenaries exactly in these places like Umbria, in the very heart of central Italy. And you wonder why, because you would expect that mercenaries would have been more used just by bigger powers who had more money to spend. It's not all that, right? It really, at that point, intertwines with strategical and operational considerations that you can come to appreciate only when you study, again, the history of that specific commune. I talk about Perugia, for example. There is some of that said. As we have seen, the discipline of infantry forces in Italy is something really unseen in the rest of Western European warfare. The most important thing, as we've seen, however, is that this infantry is not operating alone, as if, it was just a monad. Such history is slightly more complex, even because during the wars of the First Lombard League, what you actually witness is a political contrast between the milites and the pedites that brings to some important level of autonomy of the two arms from one another. You have battles like the one of Carcano, in which the infantry and the cavalry advance separately. The Imperial cavalry crushes the Lombard infantry and passes on engaging the Lombard cavalry. However, the Lombard infantry reforms and plunders the Imperial camp, while the Imperial cavalry defeats also the Lombard cavalry, and apparently there was no further engagement during the day. At Legnano, the Lombard infantrymen are left alone fighting against the Imperial cavalry charges rallying around their own carroccio. It was more like the symbol of the people, and it was a wagon cart with the bell of the people. In fact, these were the typical. It was a typical symbol that called to arms, like properly the people of the parishes, etc. It was not much to one of the city. In that case, however, what had happened really is that cavalry had been broken, so it's not much a matter of lack of cooperation. As you know, the Lombards resist, and when some further Lombard reinforcement arrives and attacks the Imperials from the rear, Lombard infantry even counterattacks, and Frederick Barbarossa is defeated, nearly escapes with his life. However, this battles, even though sort of more famous, because I think Legnano is considered, at least in pop culture, the most internationally clamorous, and one could debate how at the time this was really perceived compared to other important Italian battles. But yes, it does matter that much. This phase of Italian tactics, that at this point pioneered really by Lombardy, Tuscany arrives slightly later, but fundamentally, say, armies fought pretty much in the same way. It's just that there were less wars in Tuscany than there would have been later, and in fact, it cannot be considered it's not at the actual peak of Italian tactics and warfare. The one, as we've seen, is later. Is the one not even during the Second Lombard League War against Frederick II, where you have important episodes of infantry resistance. For example, the Lombards at Cortenuova resist until dawn at the Imperial cavalry charges, right before breaking at night away, sneaking away from. You have the Battle of Fossalta, in which the Bolognese infantry crosses the river alone without cavalry cover and engages the cavalry of the King of Sardinia, and then is reached by its own cavalry and wins. And you see, in all these battles, you have a great deal of infantry, courageousness, autonomy. At this point, nobody essentially takes on cavalry in this way, especially not abandoning, like at really Fossate sort of underrated, because there you literally, at least in the other battles, the Lombard infantry had remained sort of waiting, as normally infantry did at this point in the Western art of war, in a defensive position to meet cavalry. It was not even just an ideal thing to be in, right? Mostly infantry would act as in support to cavalry, and unfortunately we do not understand with the level of documentation of the 12th century how, not even of the first half of the 13th, how things really worked in terms of this combination. It's a big mystery actually in the Western art of war. We have different sort of hints. We know things. Think about the Italian crossbowmen at the Battle of Arsuf with the Crusader, the English cavalry, and this again, there is really a lot that could be properly analyzed, but unfortunately, it's very limited as well. And so, aside from some guesses, we do not know how this the two arms really cooperate. Again, this is a pretty universal problem. It's not just about Italy, and this is why we'll have to look at this stuff more in depth in all the various battles videos. But the most important part of Italian warfare during this period, that can again easily be seen as the most important one in the medieval art of war, is very well documented. This is the very strange thing, again, that it's so well documented that it takes too much to study well and comparatively, but it was also underrated for that reason. And so what happens in the later 13th century, something that probably is not unique to Italy, as we were saying before. There is this infantry operating on the cavalry wings, so technically they don't operate as a phalanx on their own, right? In this previous times, as we've seen, that's how it had happened, right? There were, of course, certain contexts in which infantry was more subordinated to cavalry, so it's not really normal, in fact, to see what the Lombards did, because the Lombards were the exception here. They were the ones who were also probably inspired by, facing the Imperial knights. So many infantrymen in Europe that had thought that it wasn't even possible. So it's really like the Italians are leading here. Infantry quality and standards in the Western art of war. The point, though, is that at this point there were these first clashes between the milites and the petites politically within the commune, right? And it's all the more astonishing that they would fight in open field in that way as well, because it shows how sort of discordant they were in a sense. But we do not find, for example, cavalry versus infantry, if not because accidentally, because of this detachment versus an enemy that, as we've seen, it was normally superior to just the single arm, like with cavalry, because this was the actual period of that. And this holds true for throughout all the until the mid 13th century, because that is actually the peak, technically, morally, politically, of chivalric, feudal, knightly culture. And so here, Verbruggen makes a very interesting point. That is, we can't blame the Lombard infantry at Cortenuova for having eventually broken, fled the field that night, because really what they had in front of them were the peak of medieval cavalry, really at all levels. What happens later, remember, mid-13th century, that's the moment in which the state kicks in the commune, and what this takes the form of ever more successfully is the one of actually a cooperation of the entire commune under very often a seigneurial figure, proto-seigneurial figure, under a regime that in fact is the most common by early 14th century, which is the so-called popular signory, which may seem an oxymoric terminology, but it's really not, because it shows you really what these lords were actually about. Like, there is all the Black Legion of Italian despots and tyrants, etc. But I made a video specifically on this, explaining that it's sort of weird that this, say, definitions came from countries that at the time were living under literal monarchies. This was literally the most egalitarian places where you can't find, and so it's all a matter of perspective and sort of like the ways this stuck, like in the common thinking that is often poorly informed. But the most important consequence is the political compaction of the commune, so that the two arms, cavalry and infantry, operate as one, right? Fundamentally, the cavalry battle line, which is the decisive one anyway, as we've seen, this is true in all over Western Europe, gets flanked by infantry, right? Infantry does, in this sense, does not operate anymore as a sort of battle line on its own, but as an auxiliary force on the flanks of cavalry. Now, as I was saying, this is not really a uniquely Italian tactics. Actually, it's not specifically anyone's, nationally speaking. It seems that in Western Europe, this is at least the impression that I have, because as we will explain now, there are no studies, mostly due to the lack of evidence for the other countries, that, however, I'm convinced of this, that this was the norm. Like during the 13th century, at least, it's evident that this was probably the most common thing. It's been hypothesized for lots of different contexts for reconstructing where, because this is the problem, where the hell was the infantry? Normally, feudal sources do not tell us, right? The major battles of the time, such as Benevent, Tagliacozzo, Markfeld, are all big feudal clashes, right? And we know that there were infantrymen. They are named, they are listed, but in the actual description of the battle, they miss. They're missing. Nobody cared, essentially, because most of the authors writing about these battles were doing so on behalf of the nobility. And objectively, like, cavalry was important, so it's not like they were obscuring, say, some infantry superiority, but at the same time, they don't make us understand at all where this infantry was, which may seem paradoxical, because you have an entire system like Europe that is also fairly well documented after all. Again, if you habituate yourself with Italian sources standards, you will find everything dramatically under-documented anywhere else. But in fact, it's not easy, even in Italy, to understand at that point where infantry was. You see, until the 12th century, more or less, you have these battles in feudal warfare in which they tell you that infantry was deployed, irregularly, asymmetrically on the flanks, or separated, like in this Lombard context, in echelons or whatever. There is not that centrality of cavalry push and charge, right? The 13th century is the peak of that, however, and so the most standard tactic was to deploy, as you know, a battle line behind the other, so that this cavalry reserves would, be launched into the fray one after the other. Like waiting, of course, for each other to finish, because otherwise it would have engulfed the entire system. But they were spaced even half kilometer, right? There were hidden reserves that could be even much more detached, and we still have to cover a lot of videos, battle videos, to properly exemplify this, because we haven't even begun, to be honest. And so if you realize the necessity of having this corridor for heavy cavalry to charge and break in between. Like infantry cannot but have been deployed on the wings. That's however you turn it, the most logical, coherent, and ergonomical way you can use those troops. And in fact, in Italy, we have the proof of this, because this is the only country in which this tactics is documented homogeneously, macroscopically, overabundantly, and really making sense of all the interaction between this cavalry and infantry. I found this tactic used, for example, in at least for a single battle line by the Teutonic Knights in Estonia, right? Now, the reason why this is the case is it's not that the Teutonic Knights had, they would have fought this broader Western way, but the point is that in Estonia, there were few knights, because of course they cost a lot in the local system. I mean, if you built medieval Estonia, it was incredibly poor and underdeveloped, and so there were lots of infantrymen readily available as auxiliary forces to the Teutonic Knights that would constitute so much, like, given the lack of stratification in the country, they had almost no cavalry as a consequence. Like an important element that the Livonian Chronicle, for example, talks about, I found something also in the Styrian Chronicle, refer always to this Baltic context, but it's just an accident, and I'm sure that there is something else elsewhere, but I studied most battles of the period, and it doesn't seem that there is any major clash that sort of at least has a source telling us where infantry was. And I don't know, that there is the reconstruction of the Battle of Legnica that states that the infantry was likely on the wings. Likely because it's not explicitated, not even for the peasant crossbow. So the most, however, important point is that Italy is the place where this is not just overly documented, but it takes on. I think this was happening all over 13th century Europe, but here it's also very well documented because it's the armies are very developed, meaning that the role of infantry was enormous and spectacular in the first place, right? If you take a 30,000 man army as at the regional level in Lombardy or in Tuscany, normally this facing foes would actually be, you realize that if you make the maths, you have a block of 5,000 pikemen, or infantry anyway, on each side of cavalry, the cavalry battle lines. 5,000 men were able to maintain the alignment perfectly, by the way, because in none of these battles there is any trace of evidence of any of the system breaking down, the infantry not performing well. No, right? They're actually maintaining very high standards and possibly even having stronger ones than the ones they had during the time of the Lombard League. But since they are subordinated to cavalry, which is stronger relatively to them, we also got this perspective obscured. But again, these blocks, like, you don't find them even in Renaissance armies. You know that after the mid-14th century crisis, this system dries up, and in fact, you don't find all these bulky, large medieval, like, infantry forces anywhere, right? If you look at what the Swiss did in the 15th century, it's not that they had larger armies than this. Like, infantry was actually deployed in larger numbers and with impressive collective training levels that really are not to be found even in the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, yes, you find, of course, infantry that is better drilled to use pikes uniformly to take on cavalry. This is not present in the Middle Ages, and that's why it's so important. But if we speak of size only, and in this sense the level of collective training and also of arms cooperation, this medieval civilization here in the art of war was incredibly ahead, but I mean radically, insultingly ahead, right? And because cavalry had to move and infantry had to be next to it. And of course, they would proceed at a speed that would allow, of course, them never to break. There's a very idiotic version on the Battle of Campaldino that wants the Aretinian infantry to have been detached by the cavalry, but it's completely made up by a completely wrong historiography that's just repeated itself over and over since the humanist Bruni, that literally makes up the account for reasons of his personal nature. I will explain this because I'm writing something actually on this stuff. And we find instead an incredibly high standard of collective training here maintained and absolutely not celebrated. And you don't find this stuff in the rest of Europe, right? So you see, when people talk about the Battle of Courtrai, how many infantrymen were there at Courtrai? What did they do? There were, Verbruggen himself says 8,000-10,000. What did they do? They stood behind a ditch waiting for cavalry charges, and technically they were even broken by the French. It's just a reserve that sort of manages to stamp that. What did the Italians do in the same time? Well, deploying 3,000 knights and 30,000 men, and infantry, all operating in open field, aligned with cavalry battle lines and enveloping on the enemy flanks after having broken with combined armed tactics of pike and crossbows each other's wings. Has anybody ever written about this? No. Well, how many people have written about the Battle of Courtrai? That's not to say, of course, that the Battle of the Golden Spurs was not important, but if we speak in terms of sheer art of war and level of military systemic development and what it means to be a civilization and a state, why have the Italian hosts of the period been left out? Like, this doesn't happen once, it happens repeatedly in massive battles. Again, of those people who say that medieval armies were small and that because of fragmentation. Well, the Italian kingdom, as I've seen, was pretty fragmented, but they fielded the largest armies there regularly, every few years, both in Lombardy and in Tuscany, for generations. And has anybody tracked this? Does anybody talk it? It's painful, really, to an incredible extent. But it's also important, in fact, to be serious about this all, because medieval history, you see, this is not like, a detail, right? This is just like the foundation of our entire understanding of medieval warfare turning out to be criminally rigged in the very essence. At a continental level, also at a global level as a consequence, altering dramatically our own perception of this medieval warfare. And we discover it because at the end of the day, the cat is out of the bag, but if anything, because of Schwerpunkt's videos. But remember that you have been told history by people who claim to be the great experts and scholars and people with great and high culture, and that don't even know like the ABC of major Western warfare history. Remember that when you go to sleep at night, when you wake up in the morning. That's what do you want to be? Because that's the simple question there. It's do you want to be like a puppet? Do you want to be a joke? History, if you wonder why make all these videos in the first place, it's not something you can learn by reading a couple of books and asking for citations, right? That's what children do, right? History is made, which is a completely different thing, right? And the rest you have to habituate just to see as either in passive terms or like sort of making up some strange hierarchy of relevance that you must defend by essentially altering your perception of, let's say, an otherwise sort of objective reality. So it's really disturbing. In any case, by the degree by which this was happening, the discipline of infantry was, especially its coordination with cavalry, was really the top in Western European warfare. It doesn't really find any match, nor after this, really, in inside. In the early modern age, you have basically like infantry dominance. So at that point, things get slower on the battlefield, and so in the coordination with cavalry starts sort of increasing importantly in more dynamic terms in just the mid 17th century, right? That's the thing that matters here. So consider what importance this legacy really has, right? And there is a lot of, by the way, hints of the fact that also, in fact, the rest of Western European infantry development was influenced by the Italian one, especially in those countries that were historically more connected with it. For example, big Flanders. The Counts of Flanders were southern Italian vassals of the Angevin kingdom, right? And Flanders, as you know, traded heavily with there. You have with Italy, you have Villani going out. He says after the Battle of Courtrai, like on the battlefield the day after, and there are during even the expedition of Henry VII, you have the Dampierre participating into local Italian warfare. And the interesting aspect of this is that you see, for example, the French sending Lombard, Tuscan infantrymen to fight the Flemish just after the Battle of the Golden Spurs. You find those same people had fought in Italy that lead the same Flemish at this point at home. And the sources say that these Italian contractors that were sent there were quite impressive for, say, the same Flemish infantries that had defeated the flower of French cavalry in open field. So there is something there, like as even in a place like Flanders, so you would think to be importantly civilized, right? But again, make an experiment, read, I don't know, Villani's Chronicle and say the Annales Gandenses in comparison. They are contemporary sources. The latter seem to be written 100 years before, just by form, by structure, by detail. Like it's shocking, it's astonishing. Like we have basically obscured the level of continuity, like in the superiority of Southern European civilization throughout the Middle Ages, as if no, they were kind of all alike. They weren't. There was a massive radical divide, and so this also as a consideration has been eliminated by, and especially for a country like Italy. Let's be honest, this is obvious here that there is a Roman connection with it. In Spain, they didn't have the same things, but it's not about, I don't know, the climate or whatever. This has to do with civilization strictly net. It's how can you deny that? Right? How can you, can't you notice that? Right? You can't if you remain stuck just in your own place, right? And you think that the Middle Ages are just the fare for any person who just wants to sectarially isolate in a paranoid way in their own, boundary, just because it makes them feel better that, I don't know, their country sort of existed already at the time in some way, and erasing differences, right? Pretending that standards, values that do not really exist, that there is no deal here, that Italy is just a complicated place to study because, I don't know, weird things, the Pope, the Emperor, like if you can't give that civilizational hierarchy to the investiture controversy, that's also why I insist so much also on the Gregorian reforms, on the recovery of Roman law, etc. You think that that's just the boring part of the Middle Ages. It means you don't know anything about the Middle Ages. But I mean literally anything. Even if you have grown obsessed with the pseudo idea of it through video games, through whatever you think, like movies, etc. Just know that that's not Middle Ages, right? It's just a sort of comic book for, say, highly emotional people. The reality of history is something very, very different. Now, there have been scholars, by the way, analyzing this, because of course somebody realized that there was something here that was extraordinary. Think Nicole, right? Nicole, as you know, made an astonishing work, especially in terms of iconographic archaeological evidence for medieval warfare, and he wrote also other stuff, but he was mostly fixated with the Crusades, right? I use the term fixated because, of course, I'm criticizing him, because for a specific reason. See, he came out, he knew a lot about medieval warfare. It's not to say that I've learned a lot from him that is totally valid, you can study, but he also came, at the beginning of the video I was talking about those disclosure books, like similar things that he wrote with that compendium purpose, but also in a time in history in which, of course, technology, not necessarily determinism, but the sense that, oh look, technology is shared and it creates different things. So giving too much importance to the causal mechanism in explaining military history, and especially sticking to that sense of style, and technology intended as a bit of style as well, because actually when you study medieval sources archaeologically or iconographically, it's obvious that things looked pretty similar. You can find parallelisms, you can find surely influences. That's how you should study as well, but you're also looking at sometimes very crude representations provided with some artistical license, and that's not just per se, even just considering that it's just a representation and it's limited also in terms of availability of something that was a much more complex thing, right? Like an army, and imagine all the armies that ever fought during these centuries. So Nicole tended, but we'll see how he also stopped this at a point with Italy, paradoxically, because he's a guy that tended to make a lot of those assumptions regarding the fact that the West somehow developed. It's a very common narrative still today. Most of its technology in these centuries because of the Crusades and the contacts with the Byzantines and the Arabs. And with Italy, that of course was close to the Byzantine and the Arab world, it was the gate to the east, as we've seen. Like the Italians allowed logistically the Crusades to even happen, and they had been in the east quite before that, and so surely had intense contacts with those places, are paradoxically not providing us with the direct link and evidence that what was developed in the peninsula in parallel to these military accomplishments was actually the fruit of somebody else's influence or borrowing or whatever, however you think, copying, right? People are obsessed with this idea. Why? Because of course these systems were not even just intuitively are not developing because somebody else tells them to do, right? Italy was obviously with the revival of medieval civilization to reboom from Roman times, just because it had still the essentials, the fundamentals of that, and therefore they would develop something that would be at the same level and of the needs, at least such powerful communities warring against one another wanted to have, right? The notion, however, that Nicole and other authors, also in part following him, says that the Crusader states had something similar to what we see in Italy in terms of cooperation between cavalry and infantry. The reason why he says that is that, as it's notorious in the Crusades, there were different circumstances in which cavalry tended to be bogged down more by horse archery, even though the extent to which this was true should really be seen. In any case, the idea is that as a general, because the point is that the Westerners did have important missile capacities on their own, right? This is not a mystery. We see it since the beginning of the Crusades, that the Byzantines were aware of that, even just from Latin warfare in Europe. So it's I'm always very, 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 very skeptical. It's not to say that there isn't something to it, but to present it as a major linking point is sort of strange to me. Also, there was a lot of dismounting, and so infantry at some point, even in, say, Crusader armies, were mostly sort of, say, feudal ones, right? There were feudal Latin forces. There were some Italians that would bring they're very good militias into the equation. But generally speaking, we're looking at an army that could be like, I don't know, the one you would see in France, right, in Belgium, mostly. That's the overall picture. And it is possible, of course, that the Crusader states had having less feudalism in that was their state, in their administration, would have generated less cavalry force or whatever. And so would have obliged the arms to cooperate more, not having this just cavalry dominant thing. I personally don't think that, just at least you will see it better in other videos about Crusades battles, but there are just some episodes in which we're told that there were things like even wagons on the battle, but there were just even also small engagements and times in which we are told this, and it's just maybe because, you know, in that battle things had happened that way, but we don't see a continuous interaction between these forces in a way that you can simply say, well, in Western Europe we didn't have it. Because we did have it. Like if you look at, I don't know, English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, every Scandinavian warfare, of course, cavalry and infantry had always been pretty tied with one another. So that, again, how do you quantify or measure like combined arms integration, for example, in the Crusader states? The Crusader states lasted also relatively few. They like literally one century at the end of the day of full functionality, for which you can call like at least that, I don't know, of Jerusalem a real state, so that you can identify a statal army, like an army of regional size that was reduced also in numbers actually because of many limits, and say we can compare this to the, I don't know, just to the regional scale of Lombardy and Tuscany in a more, say, in a level of continuity and comparison, right? Things were changing. Like in the Kingdom of Jerusalem had sort of more emergential situation than places at home. This cooperation that we see in Italy is really not to be seen in Crusader states that are just more some sort of broken feudal reality at some point than much else, right? You can see more adaptation, more. Oh, you have things like, I don't know, the Turco Poles. Yes, that is fascinating, but it doesn't make just as a type of unit, just the numbers, especially it does not explain it. Like we don't have the full picture of the scale of the interaction of these units, and there is evidently not much one to begin with, like to appreciate. This were again armies mostly going at war with what they had just, and as most armies really do, and there wasn't much of an option even to begin with of how they had to go to war. Like they relied on the ultra elite of the monastic military orders that, for that matter, were also very militarily typical of Western Europe. They didn't have so many, like, there's not a military civilization developing in parallel. And telling the truth, when you look at the Crusader states, and because Nicole says that, of course, we have Byzantine and Islamic examples of cavalry and infantry cooperation. Sure, this is also true, right? It's not to say that there wasn't such a thing also in the Crusader states as a legacy of the previous systems. Of course, the local military systems had never been really that regionally based. I mean, Syria and Palestine were lands of conquest rather than, say, subtle armies like Egypt or, say, Mesopotamia or the Byzantine Empire, right? But even when we look at the latter and we observe the level of, say, in fact, combined arms interaction, we don't really see, for example, any specific strength of infantry comparable not just with the ones of Italy only, but I would say with the ones of the West in the first place, right? And the reason is a bit too long to explain. At least I did so at length in many other videos for explaining what Byzantine and Islamic societies really were. At this point, they didn't have that level of vitality, of autonomy or liberty that, for example, the Italian communes really have. Nobody has city-states, not even the other Europeans, telling the truth. But especially, nobody has the mercantile dynamism of the Italians. The Venetians take over the Byzantine Empire. The Pisans, the Genoese, occupy the ports of the entire Mediterranean. Also from those Islamic powers that still traded with them. There is just here like part of a broader Western development. It just does not match like the Byzantine infantries, or I have a video incoming on Syrian infantries of this time. For example, the Syrian infantries seem to have been, they're a good example because there was a level of urbanization and fortification in Syria that is relevant to recognize. That's why I'm making that video in the first place. But these cities have nothing to do with the level of political organization or even the same level of urban development that a Tuscan or a Lombard city really have. And they don't have the political liberties, they don't have the per capita wealth, they don't have the material availability, they don't have the political connections even with one another. There is none of that civilizational scale here. And as a consequence, yes, we know that there were Syrian infantrymen. Why? Because we know that in the forces list there were, 10,000 infantry from Syria, say. And so obviously we're not even told like how they were specifically provided, but we realize, of course, from many other indicators that this militias existed. But do they hold their ground in battle? Right? The Islamic armies in which they are employed are not of the same type, Turkic influence type, with essentially horse archery and heavy cavalry dominating. Their auxiliary forces, they were good. I mean, in terms of, like, by medieval standards, like, yeah, they were medium kind of infantry. And then, in order, it's the same problem you see of not having studied the actual battles for discovering how the later communal Italian armies fought. If you don't make the comparison between them, you can't properly appreciate the validity, properly the military quality of these forces in the first place. That's the only way you can make military history. Point. Right? All the rest is just oh my God, there were infantries as well. So is it just like they influenced the Italians, or and why not the other way around? For example, that's always the sort of creepy narrative that we're presented with, and in front of the most obvious evidence that every place in the sedentary world had infantry, and it more or less was the same thing, right? And that what actually matters is not technology, and the Italians were more advanced than the Syrians for sure, but collective training, moral force, right? And given the level of armies' cooperation and the level of resistance of the infantry, yes, the Italian background was pretty unique, and so you can hardly claim that there is some, say, of course there was some influence reciprocally to any place, but heuristically speaking, how relevant is this? Like, where do you draw the line? How can you quantify or even claim? Or why do you have to put that into that relation as opposed to, especially the West, having to copy the East for some reason? This is the entire narrative for the Crusades with things like crossbows, trebuchet, whatever. Why? We know, after all, philologically, literary, and historically pretty well that Europeans began to get those books. First of all, themselves. They went to the East themselves to get books that they already knew they existed, where they were searching for them, which tells you how culturally advanced they were. To perfect theory for the sake of teaching in military historical contexts that had already developed and fully matured the relative technologies, right? So this is a story that must end. Just like people who think that the Renaissance was triggered by a bunch of Greek books brought by Byzantine refugees to Western Europe, and that the Middle Ages ended because of that. Like, this is just an insanely childish way of even considering the world. I don't know what's wrong with, and it mostly stems from, it's first of all self-sabotaging, self-hatred, like anti-Western ideology, materialism, determinism, technologism, progressivism, to the point even of denying the achievements of, say, the superiority of Western civilization without the need, in fact, to denying the very existence of those things there before anything had made them cool, even by making them come from somewhere else, right? According to you, at least. So I'm particularly invested in these topics because I've had the luck, in many ways, to study these topics for long enough and getting that level of, say, like comparative diachronical awareness that allows me to say, okay, I looked into this, there is not what you're talking about. We're talking about this, I can't compare it with that. Many scholars, even very good ones, don't have this, and don't have, for example, Nicole hasn't really studied, hasn't, he's dead, so it's not, I shouldn't be using this tense, right? But you can check his work, and he wouldn't, for example, work the way I did. Like, I just every day study battles, I reconstruct battles, fundamentally. I look at the sources, battle after battle, all the sources, reconstruct the battle, make sense of it, publish, of course, like send it, peer review it, published, one after the other. And this is what I've been doing for years and years, and this teaches you literally how technically similar medieval warfare is to one another, to actually spot the differences and being sort of practical about what matters, say, concretely, at least in a level, in an acceptable level of accurate way. Because you see, these say statements are you can find in Nicole's work of what's the the Age of Crusades. I don't remember how the bigger one with all the iconographical evidence. They're like the work is insane. This guy wrote every single damn piece of archaeological, and he redrew the actual iconographical the iconographic evidence. But all what he does is stops there, says this piece looks like a place, like the one of a place I saw in this other place, and then makes what are at best sort of extemporary guesses, like say, oh, maybe there was an influence because these things look similar. End of the study. Study that does not properly is not meant even to make that much of an explanation. But anyhow, I'm rambling a bit too much. Look, as I said at the beginning, I'm not going to finish this ever today. Likely I won't finish it even next time. But hey, we will see. Like there is just too much Italian warfare, and we will surely have to expand this to some other parts of Schwerpunkt, because I think we talked too few about it, to be honest. In any case, for today, stop it here. The video again is like suspended, like there is going to be the other part. You can find all this in the like in the History of Warfare playlist, in the Medieval Italian Warfare playlist, also the more generic ones. But I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.